Hello, I'm Christy Graham. For people watching this video, I'm here today with Dr. Steve Lochmann with the University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff. I am the Trout Management Program Supervisor for Arkansas Game and Fish Commission. We're currently doing some really cool research down on the Little Red River here in Arkansas. That is Greer's Ferry tailwater. You might hear us talk about that interchangeably today, but it's the same place. But a few years ago, we revisited our management plan for the Little Red River trout fishery. And a big part of that management plan is outlining our goals and objectives for the managing the trout population. So some of those things were to investigate the brown trout spawning habits down there. And so we've enlisted Steve's help. So Steve, it's nice to talk to you today. Go ahead and tell us, why did we talk to you about doing this project in the first place?
Well, Christy, good day, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to visit a little bit. I hope that your guests and the people that watch this video find it informative. I'm going to do a little bit of screen sharing here, and anybody who's been on the Little Red River might recognize this. This is Cow Shoals, and my understanding is that there was some angler concern over what happens on Cow Shoals during the spawning season. My understanding was that there's a lot of catch and release because there's a lot of brown trout on the shoal and they're relatively easy to catch during the spawning season. And there was some concern that maybe catching fish interrupted them during the spawning process. And even the ingress and egress of anglers in the Cow Shoals walk-in area opens up the opportunity for people to maybe be stepping on fish nests. Fish nests are called reds, R-E-D-D. And when I talk about a red, I'm not talking about the color, I'm talking about a fish nest. And there are reds here, and people that step on them are really stepping on the gravel beneath which there are fish eggs. So our interest was in finding out just how important Cow Shoals was and the spawning that happened there relative to spawning anywhere else in the tailwater.
All right. Yeah, and for the rest of folks watching this as well, the tailwater that we manage for trout does extend 30 miles from Greer's Ferry Dam down to the 305 bridge access. So it's quite a bit of area that we're covering for this project, and just let you know that it's not just limited to this half-mile stretch of Cow Shoals catch and release area. So Steve, what have we learned so far during this project?
So if there is anything that I want people who watch this video to remember after the video is over, there's really three things that I think are important, and that is, we know that brown trout will spawn anywhere that conditions are right. And I think we'll talk about what I mean by right conditions a little later. But one of the things we found is that conditions are right for brown trout spawning throughout the entire tailwater. And finally, one of the things we learned is that brown trout sort of stay in their neighborhood. They don't make long movements up and down the tailwater either during the spawning season or even at other times.
So to follow up on that, so how did you figure out where brown trout spawn during this study? What are the methods you used for that?
Okay, so here's what we did. Basically, every 2 weeks during the spawning season, we would run the entire length of the tailwater in a boat. And every time we got to a shoal, my colleague, Derek Owen, who you see in the picture, would get out at the shoal and he would carefully walk around the shoal, identifying those spots with clean gravel, because that's the indication that there's a red there. It's a depression in which a female lays eggs, and then she covers those eggs up a little, and anglers or scientists will see those as little round spots with very clean gravel. If you've been out during the spawning season, you know what I'm talking about. And when Derek identified these, the first thing he did is he located them with a very accurate GPS system. And then he would make measurements around that red. So for example, he would take the water depth and the flow rate every place he found a red. He would then measure, for example, the size of each red. So he's got a yardstick on the bottom of the river and he's trying to measure the length and width of a red. And then he'd actually find ways of measuring the actual size of the gravel where fish made reds. So he'd measure temperature and dissolved oxygen, and then he could characterize what the right conditions looked like.
So what are those conditions? What is the magical thing that makes a trout want to spawn in the area that it spawns on the Little Red River?
Well, you can sort of see by the way that Derek is kneeling next to a red here that he's in water that's somewhere between 6 inches and a foot deep. Now, he's doing this when the power company is not generating. So we call that base flow. And at base flow, water that's about 6 to 12 inches deep, and water that's moving at a rate of about 1 mile an hour. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean anything to people, but in your mind, imagine how fast a baby crawls. Because if the water is flowing about as fast as a baby crawls, then the brown trout seemed to like that. But the other key that we found was that the gravel had to be the right size. Now, I thought about how to explain this to you, and the best way to explain the right size gravel, think of it like Goldilocks. It can't be too small, it can't be too big, it's got to be just right. This is an example of gravel that's too small. So you can see most of what we're looking at here is very fine-grained sand. Well, a trout wouldn't be able to do that because when a trout lays her eggs, they fall into the spaces between the gravel. There is no space between the grains of sand. This is an example of gravel that's too big because the way that a female digs that red is she lays over on her side, flaps her tail up and down, and sort of excavates a pit. Well, it would take a pretty big brown trout to try to move rocks like you see in this picture. But this gravel is just right. And you can sort of see it so anywhere between a marble and maybe a golf ball. And a female brown trout can, whip her tail back and forth and sort of excavate this. And you can see that trout eggs would fall in through the spaces of that gravel and be protected from predators, but the water would be able to move through so that the water could bring oxygen to the developing eggs and then take away waste like carbon dioxide and ammonia. So that's what good conditions look like.
Okay, that makes sense. And obviously that's some really good information for us.